Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I'm Brendan Boyle. I'm the Associate Dean for Graduate Programs, and I'm very grateful to all of you for coming to this third lecture in the Graduate Institute's Summer Lecture Series, Liberal Education in the Age of the LLM. I'll make a couple quick announcements before welcoming our speaker, Zach Gartenberg, to the podium. Those two announcements are, one, that there will be two more lectures in the series, both next Wednesday and the following Wednesday. Next Wednesday, we'll welcome our Santa Fe colleague, David McDonald, who will be lecturing on Benjamin and electronic media. And the following week, we will welcome our Annapolis colleague, Hallie Barnett, whose lecture is titled Thinking Machines. The second bit of administrative business is that on the final Wednesday of the month, we will have an all-college seminar to which you are all most warmly invited. That includes members of the public who are here tonight. You're most warmly welcome. And the Graduate Student Council has the prerogative of selecting the reading for that summer all-college seminar and are very near to having done so, and that will be distributed soon. So please come to that. With that administrative business out of the way, it's my pleasure to now introduce tonight's speaker. It's not customary to make an introduction for tutors of the college, and I don't want to break that custom, but I do just want to extend my heartfelt thanks to Zach Gartenberg for all he's taught me already and all I know he will teach us tonight. So without any further ado, I welcome to the podium our colleague Zach Gartenberg to lecture on deep learning, authentic learning, a classical contemporary inquiry. Zach.
I just want to begin by thanking Brendan Boyle for inviting me to give this lecture and for many really wonderful conversations we've had about the topics that I'm going to be talking about. Most of us can remember a moment, however small, when we suddenly understood something that had eluded us. It may have been a line of poetry, a passage of philosophy, a math problem, or a realization about another person. And just as often, we can recall the feeling of encountering something, a concept, a method, a truth, that we could mimic or repeat without quite understanding. These moments point to something we all recognize, even if we rarely name it. That there's a difference between acquiring information and coming to understand. And in an age increasingly shaped by artificial systems that learn, this difference is becoming harder and more urgent to think about. I first began wrestling with that question more seriously while preparing to teach freshman language for the first time last year. I came across a piece of advice meant to encourage humility in teaching. Languages are learned, not taught. It was a familiar idea, but it struck a deeper chord. If language or anything is truly learned, then the decisive work takes place not in the instruction, but in the mind or soul of the learner. Teaching becomes an exercise in preparing conditions, not delivering content. The burden and the mystery of learning shift inward. At the same time, like many of us, I was trying to make sense of the rapid spread of artificial intelligence in education, scholarship, and everyday life. These systems, trained on data at a scale we can barely comprehend, are increasingly described as learners. But what exactly do we mean when we say that? And what, if anything, does their emergence tell us about the nature of learning itself? These two concerns about the inwardness of learning and the rise of artificial learning systems did not at first seem connected. But as I sat with them, they began to converge. Both turned my attention back to a pair of classical texts that I had long found quietly radical: Plato's Meno and Augustine's The Teacher. Each text, in its own way, suggests that genuine learning can never be handed over by another, that it must arise from within, and that the movement from ignorance to knowledge involves something far more profound than information transfer. I found myself asking, what would it mean to read these two dialogues in conversation with the theory and practice of deep learning? What could a Socratic interrogation of virtue, a late antique meditation on inner illumination, and a multi-layered neural network possibly have in common? It's an awkward juxtaposition, but that is the point. The awkwardness is itself the occasion for inquiry. For all their differences in idiom, purpose, and structure, these three frameworks confront the same essential question. How do we come to know what we did not know before? What does it take for learning to happen, not just in practice, but in principle? Plato's Meno, Augustine's The Teacher, and the science of deep learning offer radically different answers, but all of them agree that this question, however we choose to formulate it, is fundamental. And if the answers matter, it's because the stakes are so high. What kind of beings can learn? What distinguishes learning from imitation or repetition or response? What do we owe to the processes by which we come to know? This lecture is an attempt to hold these questions open, to see what we can learn by letting them echo across these three domains. But before we can understand what Meno, the teacher, or deep learning systems reveal about learning, we need to examine the question itself more carefully. What exactly are we saying when we ask what it means to learn? And what happens to that question when we pose it across such different conceptual landscapes? We often think of learning as a technical or behavioral process, something incremental, measurable, and performance-based. But when we press more deeply into what it means to come into knowledge we did not previously have, a deeper puzzle emerges. This is not just a classical or theological puzzle. It arises, too, in the very systems we now call learning machines. So when a neural network learns, is it doing what Plato or Augustine meant by learning? If not, what's missing? If so, what are we saying about thought, truth, and understanding? A standard AI textbook defines learning as the improvement of performance following exposure to experience. This is tidy, intuitive, and seemingly comprehensive, spanning everything from memorizing a grocery list to refining a scientific theory. But it also raises immediate questions. Does learning always improve performance? Oedipus learns the truth of his origins and is ruined. In Ibsen's The Wild Duck, Gregor Zburla's commitment to painful truth shatters what peace remains. A grandmother might finally come to accept her estranged son, only to die before she can act on that change. These are real examples of learning that transforms, but not in ways that optimize. The complexity deepens when we consider the form learning takes. Meno and the teacher are not treatises. They are dialogues, investigations that unfold as shared inquiry. This form is essential. It allows room for uncertainty, missteps, and refinement, for learning itself to be enacted, not just described. It invites the reader to participate, to watch minds in motion. Might form matter in how learning happens? Might it matter that our current learning systems are built not on dialogue, but on prediction? What happens when learning becomes computation without conversation? These are the questions that animate what follows, not as problems to be solved, but as inquiries to be deepened. Our aim is not to fix a definition of learning, but to explore its meanings and what's at stake in each. Plato's Meno is a dialogue about whether virtue can be taught, but it becomes, along the way, a meditation on what learning itself entails. It centers on a paradox, stages a pedagogical demonstration, and concludes with a metaphor of knowledge as tied-down belief. Augustine's The Teacher pursues a similar inquiry, not just how we learn, but whether teaching is even possible. He traces the limits of language, the ambiguity of signs, and the inwardness of real understanding. Placed alongside deep learning systems, these works invite us to ask whether features like intention, insight, responsibility, and transformation are essential to learning or merely optional. This leads to a more refined set of questions. Is there something that learning most essentially is? If so, what distinguishes authentic learning from its simulations or approximations? And how should we evaluate today's learning systems in light of that distinction? These questions have a structure, and so too does the rest of this lecture. We begin not with Plato or Augustine, but with the model that now dominates how we think about learning, deep learning. Before we can ask what might lie beyond it or beneath it, we must understand what it is, what it does, and what it leaves out. We begin then with deep learning, not because it offers the richest account of learning, but because it now shapes how learning is pursued, engineered, and imagined. These systems are not just tools. They embody a particular model of learning built from data, computation, and feedback. To take them seriously is to ask, what exactly happens when a deep learning network learns? What kind of process is it, and how does it compare to other conceptions of learning? Deep learning is a specialized and transformative technique within artificial intelligence. It enables machines to perform tasks once thought uniquely human, recognizing faces, translating language, diagnosing disease. Those of you who have had the pleasure of attending the first 2 lectures in this series know about how deep learning is the technology behind large language models. But it's important not just for what it can do. It matters for what it forces us to ask about ourselves, our minds, and our capacity to learn. At the heart of deep learning is the artificial neural network, a layered web of computational units loosely inspired by biological brains. These artificial neurons don't replicate biology, but they mimic the idea that cognition emerges not from individual units, but from patterns of connection. Each neuron processes input by applying weights, adding a bias, and passing the result through an activation function. But we can simplify. Each layer in a network receives signals, transforms them, and passes them on. Learning happens as the network adjusts its internal parameters, its weights and biases, based on the errors it makes. This process is known as gradient descent. Imagine being on a foggy hillside, trying to find the lowest point. You take a step downhill, feel the slope, adjust, and continue. That's what gradient descent does. Small local corrections over and over until the system reaches a point of minimal error. The power of deep learning lies in its depth. Each layer performs a small transformation. Stacked together, they form increasingly abstract representations. In visual recognition, early layers detect edges, mid-level layers identify shapes, and deeper layers recognize objects or faces. Meaning is built through a hierarchy of structure, from raw input to refined recognition. This process resembles human learning in some suggestive ways. Whether reading, hearing music, or solving problems, we progress from simple to complex, from local details to integrated wholes. Learning in this model is not about sudden mastery, it's about slow refinement, the accumulation of micro-adjustments, the emergence of meaningful structure from raw experience. A neural network, then, doesn't understand its task in a way that one could regard as directly analogous with human understanding, but it does develop internal representations that make it more adept at responding to input. Its learning is recursive, incremental, and distributed. And that model, surprisingly, echoes an ancient scene, Meno's slave, slowly adjusting his beliefs through Socratic questioning without being told the answer. Like the network, he stumbles, revises, and refines his way toward insight. One might also compare the process to the St. John's Chorus rehearsing a polyphonic piece. No single voice controls the whole. Each adjusts in response to the others. Harmony emerges not from top-down instruction, but from distributed feedback. So too with a deep network. The correctness of an output emerges from billions of tiny adaptations, each one local. Deep learning thus offers a compelling model of learning as optimization. But is that all learning is? Does this model leave something out, something essential? Understanding, responsibility, insight, do these arise naturally from recursive adjustment, or do they require a different kind of structure altogether? This model shows how learning could occur without comprehension. It invites us to ask whether understanding is reducible to representation or whether something more is at stake. At St. John's, we sometimes glimpse that something more. When a tutor poses a question in seminar that no one immediately answers, but everyone starts thinking differently afterward, that might be closer to what Plato or Augustine mean by learning than any outcome we could measure. Nothing has been optimized, but something has begun. With this framework in place, we're now ready to revisit the deeper questions that first set us in motion. We began by asking, how do we come to know what we did not know before? What does it take for learning to occur, not merely functionally, but meaningfully? The case of deep learning networks complicates this question even as it sharpens it. If we take seriously the frameworks of Meno and the teacher, we are led to ask, is there something that learning most essentially is? And what qualifies a process as genuine learning? To approach these classical texts, it helps to reflect on the analogies between human and machine learning. We've seen that deep learning networks learn through repeated exposure, pattern detection, and internal recalibration. But humans, too, learn in multiple ways, some closely mirrored by machines. A pianist refining a passage through practice, a neural network reducing classification error, a student internalizing grammar through immersion, a language model abstracting syntax from data, a person forming reliable habits of thought, a neural net converging on stable activation patterns. And yet, some aspects of human learning may resist such analogies. What about transformative insight, where a person's worldview shifts, or where understanding arises not from data absorption, but from self-reflection or illumination? These might align with the Platonic and Augustinian models of recollection or divine disclosure. Are such acts of understanding beyond the reach of machines? This leads to deeper questions. What counts as the object of learning? Must learning always involve the acquisition of a fact, a concept, or a skill? Meno suggests yes. It focuses on propositional knowledge, the grasp of truth that can be defended by reason. The teacher offers a broader view: linguistic competence, inward recognition, practical know-how. Learning, for Augustine, need not always be propositional to be real. This distinction matters when evaluating deep learning. If we take a narrow view, learning as rational insight into truth, deep networks may fall short. But if we take a broader view that includes pattern recognition, competence, and adaptation, the analogy becomes more persuasive. Still, our goal is not to fix the definition of learning, but to understand what's illuminated when we place these models side by side. Two new questions will guide us. First, is a machine ever doing more than reproducing what it has been given? If its outputs are entirely traceable to its inputs, does that preclude anything like understanding, or simply redefine what we mean by it? This is the tension at the heart of the Meno, where Socrates presses the slave not just to recall information, but to move from example to principle, from repetition to insight. Second, could exposure alone to enough examples with no explicit instruction give rise to something that resembles understanding? This question echoes in the behavior of large language models like ChatGPT, which sometimes appear to infer rules, analogies, or intentions that were never seen during learning. From these questions, two possibilities unfold. The first sees machine learning as bounded by its training data, powerful, flexible, but ultimately closed, a process of refinement without understanding. The second suggests that learning may be emergent, that under certain conditions, quantity might yield quality, and pattern recognition might tip into something like insight. These possibilities lead us to a central and unsettled puzzle. Are machine learning and human learning divided by a categorical gap? Or could they, under some configuration of depth and scale, begin to converge? Meno offers profound and surprising suggestions on this score. Let us turn there now. Meno begins as a dialogue on whether virtue can be taught, but quickly turns to a deeper question: what is learning? In exploring this, Plato stages a profound inquiry into human arete, our distinctive excellence as beings capable of knowing. At stake for us, as contemporary readers, is whether the human form of learning can be replicated by machines or whether it entails something irreducibly human. The first major turning point is Meno's paradox. Meno says to Socrates, "How will you look for virtue, Socrates, when you do not know at all what it is? How will you aim to search for something you do not know? If you should meet with it, how will you know that this is the thing you did not know?" Socrates reformulates this as a dilemma. You cannot inquire into what you know, since you know it already, nor into what you do not know, since you wouldn't recognize it. The implication is stark. Learning appears impossible. But Socrates reframes the problem. Learning does not begin with knowledge, but with the intention to inquire, a willingness to put oneself in a posture of discovery. This readiness is not passive exposure. It is an act of internal orientation. Socrates dramatizes this point by questioning Meno's uneducated slave. He begins with a simple square of 2 feet per side. Socrates says, "How many feet is twice 2 feet?" The slave replies, 4, Socrates. Socrates says, "And if we wanted a square double in area, what should its side be?" And the slave answers, "It should be double the length." But doubling the side results in quadruple the area, a mistake that arises from assuming linear rather than quadratic scaling. Socrates then draws a square on the diagonal, guiding the boy to perceive a new solution. The boy's earlier belief is revealed as false, not by refutation, but by contradiction with perceptual evidence. What the slave learns is not a principle, but a correction. His intuitive model fails. He reorients himself. This resembles how neural networks refine outputs via feedback. They don't conceptualize, but adjust. Socrates notes, here speaking to Meno, "These opinions have now been stirred up like a dream, but if he, that is the slave, were repeatedly asked these same questions in various ways, you know that in the end his knowledge about these things would be as accurate as anyone's." Here we see the notion of recollection, that the soul contains latent truths awakened through questioning. But what distinguishes knowledge from true opinion? Socrates' daedalus analogy at the close of the dialogue provides the key. Here is Socrates speaking again to Meno. "True opinions, as long as they remain, are a fine thing, and all they do is good. But they are not worth much until one ties them down by an account of the reason why," and the Greek here is aitias logismo. After they are tied down, they become knowledge, episteme, and then they remain in place. The statues of Daedalus, like untethered beliefs, can escape. To know is to tie down a belief with aitias logismos, a reasoned grasp of what is responsible for its truth. This is what deep learning might seem to lack. A machine may predict well, but we might be prepared to say it cannot grasp why a prediction holds. It may be crucial to such a system that it has no insight, no ownership. What does it mean to tie down a belief? The analogy invites us to think not just about stability, but about control and responsibility. An untethered statue is not in the possession of the one who acquired it, not because it has left his grasp, but because it was never truly in his grasp to begin with. Its staying or going is not up to him. In the same way, an untethered belief, a true opinion not grounded in an understanding of why it is true, is not fully ours. We hold it, but not on grounds we ourselves can take responsibility for. And that is what makes it accidental. To know something, then, is not merely to believe it and have it be true. It is to hold the belief non-accidentally, to grasp the basis for its truth, and to stand in a responsible relation to that basis. This is what aetios logismos supplies. Not a mechanical cause, but an explanatory account that makes it intelligible why the belief must be so. Socrates thus sets down a condition for knowledge that is both epistemic and ethical. A learner becomes a knower when they are able to claim their belief not just as correct, but as their own, not by possession, but by reason. This idea of non-accidentality is what most clearly distinguishes the account of learning in Meno from the paradigm of machine learning. Deep learning systems adjust their parameters to reduce error, but there might be a fundamental sense in which they cannot know what they are doing. They might not be the sort of thing that can tie down their representations with reasoned understanding. In other words, they may be inherently incapable of bearing responsibility for the outputs they produce. For Plato, what matters is not just the process of refinement, but the relationship the learner bears to what is learned. Learning, in its fullest sense, requires that the learner come to stand behind the truth, responsibly, insightfully, and by reason. This idea will reappear in a new form in Augustine. We return to our guiding question: how do we come to know what we did not know before? With Augustine's The Teacher, the shape of the question shifts. Rather than dramatizing learning as movement from ignorance to knowledge, as in Meno, Augustine turns inward to the limits of language, the ambiguity of perception, and the conditions for understanding itself. A vivid moment in the dialogue captures the heart of Augustine's concern. He asks, how would you teach someone what the word walking means by performing it? His son and interlocutor, Adeodatus, suggests walking faster to highlight the act. But Augustine replies, isn't hurrying something different? Quote, I might have thought walking was precisely hurrying, and for that reason I would have been misled, end quote. The point is clear. Perceptual acts, even when sincere, can be misunderstood. This stands in contrast to the Meno, where the slave's visual correction leads him toward knowledge. For Augustine, even the clearest signs can fail to convey meaning. This leads to one of the dialogue's most radical claims. Quote, from words, then, we learn only words, rather the sound and noise of the words. When words are spoken, we either already know what they mean, in which case we are reminded, or we don't, in which case we are not even reminded, end quote. Learning for Augustine does not happen through speech. It happens through inward recognition, prompted but never delivered by signs. This recognition depends not on the speaker, but on the inner condition of the learner. And yet, truth is not private. In a striking passage from the Confessions, Augustine writes, quote, if we both see that what you say is true, and we both see that what I say is true, then where do we see that? Not I in you, nor you in me, but both of us in that unalterable truth that is above our minds." Unquote. Learning is personal, but truth is shared. First-hand experience is essential not because it grants ownership of truth, but because it shows that truth is not owned. Learning entails recognizing this. This gives Augustine's vision of learning three defining features. One, it must happen within the learner. Two, the truth must transcend the learner. And three, the learner must recognize that the truth is not theirs. AI, it might seem, presents a challenge not only to established practices, but to our very sense of what learning entails. At least from one perspective, it appears to lack a starting point for the structure Augustine traces. It does not obviously exhibit subjectivity, nor a memory shaped by meaning, nor a recognition of shared truth. For Augustine, memory is not mere storage, but the inward bridge between appearance and understanding. AI can store and process data, but whether it can recollect or take responsibility for what it retains is a live question, and one that goes to the heart of what learning might require. Still, if artificial systems do not clearly mirror the inward structure Augustine describes, that does not settle the question of their value. What is striking and perhaps surprising is that the teacher offers not just a way of distinguishing human learning, but a lens through which we can begin to think about how artificial systems might serve the learner, not by understanding, but by helping to awaken it. The teacher helps us ask not only whether AI can learn, but whether it can help us learn. A pivotal insight from the dialogue introduces a hierarchy of value in learning. Quote, "The things signified should be valued more than their signs. Whatever exists on account of another must be worth less than that on account of which it exists. Words exist so that we may use them. The teaching, doctrina, is therefore that much better than words," end quote. This has direct bearing on how we think about AI. If AI systems generate signs, their worth is derivative. What matters is not the tool, but the teaching, not the output, but the insight. In this light, AI can serve as a prompt, not a teacher, but a provocation. The learner must remain the agent of understanding. So we are led not to closure, but to a set of deeper complications. If authentic learning involves a relation between memory, truth, and inward responsibility, what becomes of that model in a world increasingly shaped by systems that learn without selves? If AI can help scaffold understanding, what conditions must be in place for the user to remain the one who learns? Finally, might we learn something essential about human learning by observing what these systems cannot do and what they cannot see? These questions emerge directly from the classical accounts we have considered. For Augustine, as for Plato, learning is not the successful transmission of statements. It is a phenomenon that unfolds in time, in interiority, and under conditions that cannot be fully predicted or controlled. It is inseparable from the question of who we take ourselves to be and of what we take truth to require of us. Plato, Augustine, and the science of machine learning equally allow us to bring learning into view, and in doing so, help us recognize what authenticity in learning might look like. And yet, in the process of writing this lecture, I began to question whether authentic is even the right word. It suggests a binary, real versus fake, good versus bad, precisely the kind of polarity this inquiry seeks to resist. But perhaps what I've been tracing is not a singular essence, but something closer to a family resemblance, a constellation of learning experiences that differ in form and context, yet share certain features: orientation, responsibility, interior disruption. These are not outcomes, but postures, not benchmarks, but stances. What links them is not certainty, but a kind of fidelity to the difficulty of inquiry, to the responsibility of knowing, to the disorientation that often precedes understanding. It may be that authenticity still has a role to play, but only if we let it denote not a property of the product, but a quality of the relation between learner and source, learner and truth. Recall the standard definition of learning from the AI textbook. An agent is learning if it improves its performance after making observations about the world. It's a clean, serviceable formulation, but it defines learning entirely in terms of external outcomes. There is no inquiry into the stance of the learner or the structure of her relation to what is learned. Learning becomes functional improvement, not a transformation of the subject. Plato and Augustine help uncover what this view leaves out. Both link authentic learning to the learner's relation to the origin of what is learned. Learning, for Socrates, requires becoming the non-accidental cause of one's beliefs, standing behind them in a way that reflects epistemic authorship. The slave's geometrical inquiry models this in part. He adjusts his responses, refines his understanding, and eventually reaches a solution, not by being told, but by being guided into poise, a readiness to ask and respond well. Plato's first insight is that learning depends on this poise. His second, from the Daedalus passage, is that knowledge differs from mere belief in being tied down by a reasoned account, etias logismos. That tying down is what renders a belief responsible and knowledge authentic. Augustine's understanding of learning emphasizes guidance. Learning occurs not through words or signs, but through inward recognition, prompted but never caused by external cues. The true teacher is not another person, but the illumination of the mind by something that comes from within. For Augustine, this source is God. Yet this is not just theological. It articulates something more broadly felt. That meaningful learning is shaped by persistent influences we find ourselves returning to, testing ourselves against, and learning to trust. These may be texts, experiences, values, individuals, or ideas that become, over time, sources of orientation. Augustine's claim is that genuine learning involves returning to these sources, not in a recursive loop, but in an unfolding recognition of their formative presence. Optimization models show how learning can be modeled functionally. Plato and Augustine show how learning can be lived. In the Meno, the slave boy's iterative adjustments under Socratic questioning do in fact resemble deep learning processes, refinement through feedback, approximation toward a result. The continuity here is real, but partial. What machines appear to lack is the second-order relation to learning itself, the capacity to own, reflect on, or be guided by the process in a way that isn't just a matter of recursion. The difference lies not in adjustment, but in the ability to step back from adjustment and ask, what am I becoming by learning this? That brings us back to our deeper dilemma. Can learning ultimately be reduced to data absorption and model tuning? Or is there an ineliminable aspect of learning that resists formalization, something about how the learner relates to what is learned? The emphasis in Plato and Augustine on an orientation toward the source of what is learned helps us see where the boundary lies. In Plato, it is the shift from belief to knowledge through the possession of an account. In Augustine, it is the transition from prompting to recognition through inward illumination. In both, learning is not just a change in what one holds true, but a change in how one holds it, a movement toward responsibility, guidance, or attunement. So what kind of insight do Plato and Augustine offer? These are not strict definitions. They are characterizations that illuminate the experience of learning, making visible what it means to learn well. The optimization model explains how learning proceeds. These thinkers ask, when does it matter that it does? What does it take for learning to be not just functional, but authentic? They offer no final answers, but they sharpen the questions. And that, perhaps, is what learning most deeply is, not just a process of acquiring more accurate beliefs, but of entering more fully into the questions that shape our relation to the world. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Let's stretch our legs, take a breath, and we'll reconvene in McDowell 14, just over here in 5 or so minutes for the question period, to which you are all, of course, warmly welcome. So stretch your legs, walk around, and we'll see you in McDowell 14 in 5 minutes.